Hey, this is Tony from the Cold Case Project, where we focus on unsolved cases across the United States. Our mission is to bring attention to these unresolved mysteries that need your help. All the information we cover in these cases is readily available on the internet, but we rewrite and repurpose it for the purpose of these videos. Our goal is to spread the word about the thousands of unsolved cold cases still out there. Thank you for watching. If you want to help shed light on these cases, make sure to like and subscribe for more content. Your support can make a difference.
Chris Jenkins was a bright, well-liked business student at the University of Minnesota. He was the captain of the school's lacrosse team, known for his humor and charisma. He grew up in Eden Prairie, Minnesota, with his parents, Steve and Jan, and his sister, Sarah. On the night of October 31st, 2002, Chris attended a Halloween party at the Lone Tree Bar and Grill in Minneapolis, Minnesota, dressed as a Native American. He was accompanied by his girlfriend and another couple. However, sometime around midnight, he was inexplicably ejected from the bar. He left behind his phone, wallet, and jacket, stepping into the cold Minnesota night with nothing but his costume. A bouncer watched as he turned left onto Hennepin Avenue, and from that moment on, he was never seen alive again. His sudden disappearance marked the beginning of a troubling pattern that would grip the upper Midwest. 6 days later, on November 6th, 22-year-old University of Wisconsin student Michael Knoll vanished after celebrating his birthday at a bar in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Just 3 days after that, on November 9th, 20-year-old Josh Gehman disappeared after leaving a small gathering in an apartment in Collegeville, Minnesota. The eerie similarities between the cases were impossible to ignore. 3 young, white, college-aged men, all of similar height and weight, all vanishing at night after drinking at bars or parties, and all disappearing near bodies of water. The fact that all 3 vanished within a 100-mile radius of Minneapolis sparked theories of a potential serial killer operating along the Mississippi River. On February 27, 2003, Chris' body was discovered in the Mississippi River, lodged between logs near the 3rd Avenue Bridge and St. Anthony Falls. The discovery of his remains was a tragic confirmation of his fate, but it also raised more questions than answers. Just 1 month later, on March 25th, Michael's body was found in a lake, not far from where he was last seen. Despite the unsettling similarities, the FBI and local law enforcement ruled out any connection between the deaths of Chris and Michael and the disappearance of Josh. An autopsy determined that Chris had drowned, with his blood alcohol level well above the legal limit. However, the manner of death was listed as unknown. Authorities initially believed that his death was either an accident or a suicide. They theorized that intoxicated and possibly distraught after an argument with his girlfriend, Chris may have stumbled to the nearby Hennepin Avenue Bridge and either fallen or jumped into the river. By 2004, the case was closed, with authorities deeming his death an unfortunate, alcohol-related accident. Chris' parents, however, were not convinced. They believed their son had been murdered. They hired a private investigator who noted troubling inconsistencies in the official version of events. Notably, Chris did not exhibit the kinds of injuries one would expect if he had fallen from a high bridge. Furthermore, his parents uncovered discrepancies suggesting that his body had not been in the water the entire time he was missing, contradicting the assumption that he had drowned on the night of his disappearance. They also accused the police of mishandling the investigation, failing to interview key witnesses at the bar, and neglecting to treat the location where his body was found as a crime scene. Retired detectives Kevin Gannon and Anthony Duarte, who had been investigating a series of mysterious drowning deaths involving young men along the Interstate 94 corridor, examined Chris' case. Their findings contradicted the official ruling of an accidental drowning. They noted that the position of his body and other forensic evidence suggested he had not simply fallen into the water while intoxicated. Then, in 2005, a surprising lead emerged. Authorities received a tip about Chris' death from an inmate serving time on unrelated charges. The man claimed that he and an accomplice had targeted Chris on the Hennepin Avenue Bridge that night. According to him, Chris was an easy target for a mugging because he was intoxicated. When they discovered he had nothing of value, His costume had no pockets, meaning he had no wallet on him. The accomplice allegedly grew angry and threw him over the bridge railing into the Mississippi River. This new information prompted the police to reopen Chris' case. By November 2006, authorities reclassified his death as a homicide. However, Chris' family remained skeptical of the new theory that he had been tossed from the bridge. They pointed out that when his body was recovered, his slip-on shoes were still on his feet, his costume was intact, and his arms were crossed. They believed these details indicated that he had not been thrown into the river, but had been abducted, possibly forced into a van, driven around, and ultimately murdered before being dumped in the water. In 2007, police identified a suspect in Chris' case and presented their findings to the county attorney. However, the attorney determined that there was insufficient evidence to bring charges against the suspect, leaving the case unresolved. One name that surfaced in connection with Chris' disappearance was Jeremy Lynn Alford, a convicted murderer who had been at the same bar as Chris on the night he vanished. Alford was serving time for the 2005 murder of Douglas Miller, but he refused to speak about Chris' case. Adding to the mystery, another man came forward with a disturbing story. He had visited the same bar a few months before Chris disappeared. After having just one drink, he became violently ill and nearly lost consciousness. As he struggled to stay alert, a group of men attempted to put him into a car, but a friend intervened just in time to save him. When the man was taken to the hospital, doctors discovered that he had a dangerously high level of GHB, a powerful sedative, in his system. This revelation led to speculation that Chris may have been drugged in a similar fashion before he was abducted. Chris' parents remained steadfast in their belief that he was the victim of an organized group of killers. Retired detectives Gannon and Duarte supported this theory, linking Chris' case to a disturbing pattern of drowning deaths involving college-aged men across multiple states. They pointed to over 40 similar cases, spanning 11 states, where young men vanished under strikingly similar circumstances and were later found dead in bodies of water. Their theory became known as the smiley face killer theory, based on their claim that a smiley face had been found painted near several of the crime scenes. According to them, this graffiti was the killer's signature, a symbol taunting authorities while marking the locations where the victims had been disposed of. The detectives believed that the victims had been drugged, abducted, possibly tortured, and then ultimately dumped into the water to make their deaths appear as accidental drownings. Despite these alarming claims, mainstream law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, have remained skeptical of the smiley face killer theory. They argue that the evidence does not support the existence of an organized group of serial killers preying on young men. Instead, they maintain that the vast majority of these cases are tragic accidents, often involving alcohol consumption and the dangerous proximity of water. However, for the families of the victims, these explanations provide little comfort. Chris' case remains open, and his parents continue to seek answers. Whether his death was the result of a random mugging gone wrong, a carefully planned abduction, or part of a larger pattern of targeted killings, the truth remains elusive. To this day, the mystery of Chris Jenkins' death, and those of the many other young men who have drowned under suspicious circumstances, continues to haunt the Midwest. Whether these cases are truly linked by a sinister, organized force, or simply a series of tragic coincidences, the unanswered questions continue to fuel speculation and fear. Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake in the world, its waters maintaining a near-freezing temperature for most of the year. Survival in its icy depths without a life raft is nearly impossible. On May 12, 1982, 33-year-old Debbie Race became one of its many victims. Her life jacket was intact, ruling out drowning, but hypothermia had taken her life. Authorities, however, did not view Debbie's death as an accident. Instead, her husband, Larry Race, was accused of deliberately letting her freeze to death in the lake, and he was ultimately convicted of murder. Yet, despite the conviction, Debbie's own parents believed in Larry's innocence. Over the years, he filed several appeals, all of which failed, leaving him with one final attempt to clear his name. Larry, who had been serving a life sentence at Stillwater State Prison in Minneapolis, Minnesota, insisted that the jury was prejudiced against him due to his long history of adulterous relationships. He admitted to infidelity, but maintained that he had nothing to do with Debbie's death. Their marriage, once loving, had suffered greatly from his affairs. Debbie, devoted to her home, children, and church, had tried to reconcile with Larry, even as their relationship grew strained. By 1982, he claimed they had vowed to rebuild their marriage. On the night of May 11th, 1982, their 14th wedding anniversary, they went to a lakefront restaurant for dinner before taking their boat, the Jenny Lee, named after their daughters, on a Lake Superior for a late-night cruise. Larry recalled feeling hopeful about the future, determined to put his affairs behind him and rebuild his marriage. They drifted peacefully, listening to music and enjoying the city lights from a mile offshore. Then suddenly the moment was shattered. At around 9 p.m., Debbie noticed that the boat was taking on water. She panicked, remembering a previous summer when the vessel nearly sank. When they checked the engine, they saw water spraying everywhere. Larry instructed her to shut down the engine. He loosened the alternator bolt, dropping the alternator, which shut down the engine and stopped the leak. According to him, the situation seemed under control. They worked together to repair the boat, and Debbie attempted to restart the engine. It didn't work. Larry tried, but failed as well. Then, they heard a loud whooshing noise from below deck, and panic set in. Debbie insisted she wanted to get off the boat. Against his better judgment, Larry agreed. They retrieved a life raft and attempted to inflate it using a scuba tank, but it had holes and was unusable. He tossed it aside and retrieved a second raft, which successfully inflated. Debbie climbed into it, taking a gear bag containing valuables, Larry's shoes, and a scuba tank. Larry, a skilled diver with a dry suit and scuba gear, believed he could tow Debbie and the raft to safety. He had done the same for his daughters when the boat ran into trouble the previous summer. However, after several minutes of pulling the raft, exhaustion and cold overwhelmed him. He tried to climb into the raft with Debbie, but it started filling with water, causing her to panic. He stopped and looked toward the horizon, spotting lights moving toward them. Believing them to be rescue boats and closer than the shore, he decided to swim toward them. The lights, however, belonged to his own boat, which had inexplicably restarted. After resting, he attempted to locate Debbie while firing distress flares. At around 2 a.m., 5 hours after their ordeal began, he returned to shore and alerted the Coast Guard. A grid search of the lake yielded no immediate results. The following afternoon, a teenager walking home from school found Debbie's body on the lakeshore. Several months later, Larry was charged with murder. At trial, his attorneys advised him not to testify in his own defense, a decision he later regretted, believing his testimony would have convinced the jury of his innocence. The case against him was circumstantial, yet prosecuting attorney John DeSanto successfully argued that Larry had both the motive and opportunity to kill his wife. DeSanto alleged that Larry wanted to escape his unhappy marriage, citing statements from his mistresses who claimed he had criticized Debbie's weight, housekeeping, and spending habits. One mistress admitted their affair continued up until the weekend before Debbie's death. DeSanto also emphasized the $108,000 life insurance policy Larry had taken out on Debbie 7 months prior. Some of this coverage, approximately $37,000, was mortgage insurance tied to their home loan. The remaining amount came from a group policy through his credit union, and there was testimony suggesting that Debbie had sought out the additional insurance herself. The defense centered on Larry's account of mechanical failure, but the prosecution dismissed this theory. Friends who had been on the boat just days before Debbie's death testified that it had no issues. Investigators examined it after her death and found no indication of imminent sinking. Its bilge pump was fully operational and capable of removing any water that might have accumulated. After Larry's conviction, the boat was sold, and in May 1984, an independent mechanic discovered that the starter was worn and could have caused intermittent failures. He testified to this during one of Larry's appeals, but DeSanto countered that the mechanic could not confirm whether the problem existed on the night Debbie died. As a result, The testimony was deemed irrelevant in both trial and appellate courts. Another major point of contention was the number of life rafts on board. Larry insisted he had two, but the prosecution argued there was only one. Witnesses, including Larry's diving companions, testified they had never seen a second raft. The Coast Guard, conducting an exhaustive search, found no trace of it. However, Larry's brother and daughters testified that they had seen him with two rafts, though they failed to disclose this until shortly before the trial. A sheriff's deputy also testified that, 2 weeks before Debbie's death, Larry had mentioned having two rafts. But the prosecution pointed out inconsistencies in his statements, undermining his credibility. The prosecution's most damning claim was that Larry had deliberately set Debbie adrift. They alleged he returned to the boat, donned scuba gear, swam beneath the raft, and used a diver's knife to puncture it. An examination of the raft showed 5 strategically placed punctures, all inflicted while the chambers were inflated. No knife matching the puncture wounds was found, though Larry owned 2 diving knives that were never recovered. The prosecution asserted that once Debbie was adrift, Larry retrieved the damaged raft, using it as a prop to bolster his story. Curiously, water was found inside it, contradicting his initial claim that it had never entered the water. When confronted with this inconsistency, he changed his story, saying he had tossed it overboard. Additionally, both air chamber caps were securely closed, despite his claim that he had not fastened them. Defense expert Jean Aubinot argued that the prosecution's timeline was physically impossible, stating that executing their alleged sequence of events required superhuman effort. He also noted that Debbie's body was found 7 miles from the presumed location of the boat, arguing that drifting such a distance without a raft was implausible. However, DeSanto dismissed this, stating that investigators could not determine the exact location where she had entered the water. The prosecution also cited autopsy findings, stating that lividity patterns were consistent with floating face-up in a life vest, rather than lying in a raft. Ultimately, a jury of 4 men and 8 women found Larry guilty of murder. His daughters, adamant about his innocence, believe the jury convicted him based on his infidelity rather than concrete evidence. Surprisingly, Debbie's parents also supported his claims of innocence. Larry continued to fight his conviction, and after the case aired on national television, new witnesses came forward claiming to have found a life raft on Lake Superior in 1983, 1 year after Debbie's death. However, inconsistencies in their testimony regarding the date and location of the discovery led the appellate court to dismiss their claims. In May 2005, after serving 22 years of his life sentence, Larry was granted parole. He and his children remain steadfast in asserting his innocence. His case remains one of Minnesota's most controversial convictions. Given the strange circumstances and the unsettling number of bodies found in or near water, some have speculated that Debbie's death could be linked to a larger pattern. Whether Larry Race was truly guilty or the victim of an unfortunate accident remains a subject of debate, but his case is a haunting reminder of how easily the icy depths of Lake Superior can claim a life, and how, sometimes, the full truth may never surface. The disappearance of Susan Swedell remains one of Minnesota's most baffling cold cases, leaving behind an endless trail of questions with no definitive answers. Where is she now? What happened to her on that stormy night in 1988? These are questions that haunt her family, law enforcement, and anyone who has delved into the case. Susan Swedell was a 19-year-old woman living in Lake Elmo, Minnesota. Described as bubbly, funny, and full of life, she had a deep love for music, particularly Simon and Garfunkel, and enjoyed singing in her church choir. Like many young adults in their late teens, she was at a crossroads in life, unsure of her long-term plans. After attending the University of Wisconsin for 2 semesters, Susan decided to take a break from school to work and figure out her next steps. She lived at home with her mother, Kathy, and her sister, Christine, while working 2 jobs at the St. Croix Mall in Oak Park Heights, one at a clothing store called Body and Soul and another at Kmart. On January 19, 1988, Susan worked the evening shift at Kmart. She had called her mother earlier to let her know she planned to come home after work to watch a movie, but might be delayed due to a blizzard. Kathy, concerned about the treacherous road conditions, suggested Susan stay at her father's house since it was closer. But Susan declined, reassuring her mother that she'd be fine. She had been anxious about driving in the storm, but felt confident enough to make the trip home. After her shift ended at 9 p.m., Susan changed out of her red pantsuit into a miniskirt and sweater. This was strange considering the severe weather. Even her manager commented on how cold it was and how unusual it was for her to leave without a coat. But Susan, who often dressed to impress, seemed unbothered. Her coworkers took note, but didn't intervene. As Susan made her way home, she didn't get far. Her maroon 1975 Oldsmobile Cutlass overheated, forcing her to pull into a gas station at Manning Avenue and Highway 5, only about a mile from her home. She went inside and asked the attendant if she could leave her car there temporarily due to mechanical issues. The attendant agreed. However, Susan did not wait inside for help. Instead, she was seen speaking with an unidentified man. This man, described as tall, unshaven, with shoulder-length curly sandy brown hair, a well-built physique, and a 5 o'clock shadow, was wearing a leather jacket. He was driving a light-colored, older model car with sports wheels. The attendant observed that Susan and the man appeared familiar with each other, talking casually before he filled up his gas tank. Susan then got into his car, and they drove away, heading west, the direction of her home. She was never seen again. When Susan failed to return home that night, her worried mother contacted the police. Authorities located her abandoned car at the gas station. Inside, they found her purse, driver's license, and glasses, all crucial personal items, especially her glasses, since she was extremely nearsighted. It was unlikely she would have willingly left them behind. Her car was later taken to a mechanic, who discovered that the petcock on the radiator had been deliberately loosened, causing it to overheat. Investigators speculated that someone may have tampered with the vehicle, leading to her breakdown at a convenient location where she could be intercepted. But who would do such a thing, and why? Days later, an unsettling discovery was made. When Susan's mother and sister returned home, they found signs that someone may have been inside. A spare key, usually kept on a shelf near the door, had been moved. The apartment smelled of smoke, possibly marijuana, and there were extra dishes in the sink. Most disturbingly, Susan's red pantsuit, the one she had worn to work that night, was found rolled up under her bed. This raised alarming questions. Had Susan secretly returned home? If not, who had been in the house, and why did they have her clothing? Investigators probed deeper into Susan's personal life. Friends and co-workers recalled that she had been receiving frequent phone calls at work from a man named Dale. However, no one seemed to know exactly who he was. Some co-workers claimed Susan had planned to meet her ex-boyfriend that night, but he canceled due to the weather. Others stated that she had a date with a man who was allegedly a stripper named Dale. Another theory suggested she was simply meeting up with college friends. With so many conflicting accounts, it was unclear what her actual plans had been. At first, authorities considered the possibility that Susan had run away. After all, she was young and struggling to find her place in life. But certain aspects of the case made this unlikely. She left behind her last paycheck, took no money, and abandoned all of her belongings. If she had left voluntarily, why would she have staged her car breaking down? More importantly, why had someone seemingly entered her home afterward? Over the years, there were reported sightings of Susan at a waterworks facility in St. Paul, a Burger King in North Minneapolis, and a Hardee's in Ashland, Tennessee. None of these led to anything concrete. In 2006, there was renewed hope when activity was detected on Susan's Social Security number, but it turned out to be an identity thief attempting to enlist in the military. In 2018, a cold case unit was assigned to Susan's case, but despite their efforts, no significant breakthroughs have been made. Her mother and sister have submitted their DNA to missing persons databases, hoping that if her remains are ever found, they will finally have closure. Theories about Susan's fate abound. Some believe she willingly ran away with someone she trusted, but later met with foul play. Others suspect she was abducted by a predator who had been watching her, perhaps even someone from one of the chat lines she reportedly used. There is also the chilling possibility that whoever entered her home days later was responsible for her disappearance. One of the most compelling aspects of the case is the description of the man at the gas station. If Susan knew him, why has he never been identified? Was he an acquaintance, a co-worker, or someone she met online or through a chat line? Could he have been the same person who tampered with her car, ensuring that she would break down and need help? The case of Susan Swedell is a perplexing mystery that remains unsolved. For her family, the pain of not knowing what happened to her is an ongoing nightmare. If she is still out there, does she remember her past life? If she was taken against her will justice ever be served? These are the haunting questions that linger decades after that fateful January night. If you have any information about Susan Swedell's disappearance, please contact the Washington County Sheriff's Office at 430-7810. Aaron Anderson was just 22 months old when he vanished without a trace from his family's rural home in Pine City, Minnesota, on April 7, 1989. The son of Steve and Paulette Anderson, Aaron was an energetic and curious toddler who had spent the day playing inside before asking his mother if he could go outside. It was around 4 p.m. when Paulette, busy preparing dinner in the kitchen, agreed to let him play in the backyard. She told him to stay within view and frequently checked on him through the window. At one point, she saw him near the family snowmobile, just a few feet from the house with their dog close by. But when she looked again at around 4:30 p.m., Aaron was gone. The panic set in immediately. Paulette rushed outside, calling his name and scanning the yard. When Aaron did not answer, she called for their dog. The dog appeared from the front of the house, but there was no sign of Aaron. Frantic, she searched the property, checking around the house and walking down the driveway. By 5:10 p.m., after her desperate attempts to find him yielded nothing, she called the police and reported Aaron missing. What followed was an extensive search effort involving hundreds of officers and volunteers combing through the surrounding farms, fields, and dense woods. Despite their efforts, no trace of Aaron was ever found. The Anderson family's home was situated near the Snake River, which at the time was swollen with spring runoff and moving rapidly. It had risen to the point where the water line had reached their backyard. Aaron had been playing just 150 feet away from the river, and naturally, the first theory that authorities explored was that he had wandered too close and fallen in. A bloodhound was brought in to track his scent. The dog was walked in a semicircle throughout the yard, but did not detect a trail leading toward the river. When brought back to the snowmobile where Aaron was last seen and given another chance to pick up his scent, the dog reacted differently. This time, it pulled tightly on its leash, leading handlers across the yard, up the neighbor's driveway, and down a dirt road. Despite this, authorities focused on the theory that Aaron had drowned. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension seemed to support this conclusion. To test how far his body might have traveled, investigators tossed a dummy of the same size and weight as Aaron into the river. It was recovered about 200 yards downstream. Helicopters, divers, and dredging equipment were used in an attempt to locate his remains. A specially trained search dog, capable of sniffing through ice and water, was also deployed. But despite these efforts, no trace of Aaron was ever found in the river or along its banks. If Aaron had truly fallen in, why was there no physical evidence, no clothing, no remains, nothing washed up on shore? As the months passed with no definitive answers, Steve and Paulette began to doubt the drowning theory. At first, Steve believed the river had taken his son. But as more time passed, and their own investigation uncovered troubling details, both parents became convinced that Aaron had been abducted. They criticized law enforcement for prematurely dismissing the possibility of foul play, pointing out that authorities had ignored over 20 leads that suggested an alternative explanation. One investigator even admitted that, since Aaron's body had never been found, he could not rule out the possibility of an abduction. According to Steve, the bloodhound had tracked Aaron's scent not toward the river, but instead out to the road in front of their house. It then led handlers across the adjacent property, up the neighbor's driveway, and down a dirt road. This revelation only strengthened his belief that someone had taken his son. Following Aaron's disappearance, Steve and Paulette contacted multiple state and national advocacy groups for missing children. One organization issued missing person posters that stated, "Foul play was suspected." However, officials from the group had never actually spoken with law enforcement to verify this claim. Seeking answers, the Andersons hired a private investigator to conduct an independent review of the case. After obtaining signed statements from the Bloodhound's handler, interviewing local officials, and speaking with members of the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the investigator concluded that Aaron had most likely been abducted. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children also categorized Aaron's case as a stranger abduction. However, their assessment was based primarily on Steve's testimony rather than official investigative findings. In a controversial twist, Aaron's parents came to suspect that a neighbor couple in their 60s, along with their adult daughter, had been responsible for their son's disappearance. Their reasoning, however, was largely circumstantial. They simply believed that these neighbors disliked them. There was no direct evidence to link the neighbors to the case. At one point, Steve went so far as to place a sign in his yard facing their property, demanding that they bring Aaron back now. The neighbors, feeling harassed and intimidated, later moved away. They alleged that whenever they stepped outside, Steve would begin target shooting in his backyard as a form of intimidation. Steve admitted to doing this, saying, "They kidnapped my son." However, lead investigator Lieutenant Robert Johnson dismissed these suspicions, asserting that the neighbors lacked both the means and the motive to abduct Aaron. Because of this, law enforcement never formally questioned or investigated them or their daughter. Johnson remained steadfast in his belief that Aaron had drowned. Over the years, there were hundreds of reported sightings of boys resembling Aaron. The most promising lead came in September 1990, when a foster mother in Oklahoma reported a child with a striking resemblance to Aaron. The boy had been abandoned and was severely underweight. Social services could not locate a birth certificate to verify his identity, and he shared several physical characteristics with Aaron, including birthmarks. When shown a photo of the child, Paulette believed he could be her son, but Steve was less certain. Unfortunately, DNA testing ultimately confirmed that the boy was not Aaron. In November 1990, the Andersons participated in the first-ever National Conference on Abducted Children, an event sponsored by the Jacob Wetterling Foundation. The Wetterlings, whose son Jacob had been abducted months after Aaron disappeared, were also in attendance. The Andersons signed an advocacy agreement with the foundation, which allowed them to promote efforts to find Aaron. However, tensions arose between the two families when the Andersons accused the foundation of unequal distribution of resources among missing child cases. The Wetterlings denied the claim, explaining that their foundation focused primarily on education and prevention rather than direct search efforts. This disagreement led the Andersons to sever ties with the foundation. Eventually, Steve and Paulette moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, and had 3 more children. They later divorced. Despite the passage of time, Paulette has never given up hope that Aaron might still be alive. In 2019, she submitted her DNA to Ancestry.com in the hopes that Aaron, now an adult, may have done the same. Though she continues to search, no breakthroughs have been made. The case remains unsolved. To this day, Aaron's disappearance remains one of Minnesota's most haunting unsolved mysteries. His parents remain convinced that he was taken by someone familiar with the area, someone who knew the family and the layout of their remote home. From Paulette's kitchen window, she had a clear view of both the driveway and the road, which was about 175 feet away, making it difficult to imagine how someone could have abducted him in broad daylight without being seen. Yet, the theory that he drowned also lacks definitive proof. If Aaron had truly been swept away by the river, why was no trace of him ever found? Could his disappearance be linked to a larger pattern of child abductions? The uncertainty has left the Anderson family in an agonizing limbo for decades. Whether he was tragically lost to the waters of the Snake River or taken by someone lurking nearby, Aaron's fate remains a painful mystery that may never be solved. Belinda Vanleth was last seen at Little Eagle Lake in Wright County, Minnesota, around 8 p.m. on June 15, 1974. She had been house-sitting for a neighbor for the weekend and had plans to attend her sister's graduation party. Throughout the day, her family tried calling the house multiple times, but the phone lines were consistently down, which raised concerns. By the following day, when no one had heard from her, her family officially reported her missing. Investigators soon turned their attention to Timothy Joseph Crosby, a man with a disturbing history of violence against women. Crosby, who was the same age as Belinda, had already developed a pattern of attacking girls and young women by the early 1970s. He lived alone in a cabin just 100 yards from the house where Belinda had been staying when she vanished. It was later discovered that, the day before she disappeared, Belinda had visited Crosby's home looking for his sister, only for Crosby to inform her that she wasn't there. This interaction became a crucial detail in the investigation. By late 1974, Crosby had been arrested for the brutal kidnapping and rape of an 18-year-old woman, an incident that added to his already growing criminal record. Over the years, he continued to be arrested for various sexual offenses, eventually being classified as a violent sexual recidivist and placed under civil commitment. Despite his extensive criminal history and proximity to Belinda's last known location, Crosby has never been charged in connection with her disappearance. His suspected involvement, however, remains a focal point of the case, particularly given that he is also linked to the 1994 disappearance and murder of another woman who was found strangled months after she went missing. Despite these connections, the mystery of what happened to Belinda has never been solved. Those who knew her described her as a popular and ordinary teenager who had a passion for gardening. Authorities have never believed that she ran away, and from the very beginning, foul play has been strongly suspected. The case remains open, with investigators continuing to search for answers in the hope that one day, Belinda's fate will finally be uncovered. The open fields and winding back roads of southwestern Minnesota are charming, yet at times haunting and eerie. As someone who lives in the Midwest, I can attest to the vast, often featureless landscape. The region consists mostly of rolling pastures, farmland, and miles of empty space, but driving through the back roads at night can be an unnerving experience. The solitude and darkness can create a sense of anxiety, making even the most familiar paths feel ominous. Brandon Swanson was a bright, ambitious 19-year-old student at Minnesota West Community and Technical College. He had an unusual but intriguing passion for wind turbines and was studying to make a career in renewable energy. But on the night of May 14, 2008, what should have been a routine evening out turned into one of the most mind-boggling missing person cases to date. That night, Brandon went out with friends to celebrate the end of the semester. He attended a small get-together in the town of Lind, where a handful of friends gathered for drinks and conversation. Later in the evening, around 10:30 p.m., he decided to drive 30 miles west to Canby to meet up with another friend at a separate gathering. Reports indicate he had only one shot of whiskey at this second location before deciding to head home. Although Brandon was not heavily intoxicated, he was concerned about being pulled over for a possible DUI. Instead of taking the main roads, he opted for the back roads, a decision that would prove costly. These rural roads are often unmarked, poorly maintained, and easy to get lost on. A single wrong turn can lead a person miles off course. To make matters worse, this was his first time navigating these back roads alone, and he quickly became disoriented. At some point, Brandon's vehicle veered off the gravel road and got stuck in a ditch. Fortunately, he was uninjured, but now he faced an even bigger problem. He had no idea where he was. He first attempted to call several friends, hoping someone could come to his aid, but was unable to reach anyone. Left with no other choice, he swallowed his pride and called his parents. Brandon told his parents he believed he was near the town of Lind because he could see lights in the distance. He stayed by his vehicle and repeatedly flashed his headlights, hoping his parents would see him. But they never did. The search soon became frustrating, and after several hours of unsuccessful attempts to locate him, Brandon decided to start walking toward what he thought was Lind. The weather that night was chilly, around 40 degrees, and Brandon had been outside for hours. At around 1 a.m., he set out on foot, still talking to his father on the phone to provide updates on his location. After about 3 hours of walking, he decided to take a shortcut through a field rather than continue on the winding roads. And then, everything took a terrifying turn. At exactly 3:30 a.m., in the middle of a conversation with his father, Brandon suddenly let out an exclamation, "OS!" And then silence. The call did not disconnect, but Brandon stopped responding. His father called out his name repeatedly, hoping his son had simply dropped his phone, but there was no answer. The silence stretched on, and panic set in. Something had happened to Brandon. His parents spent the rest of the night desperately searching for him. At 6:30 a.m., realizing the situation was dire, they contacted the police. Unfortunately, their concerns were initially dismissed. Officers suggested that it was normal for a young man his age to stay out all night and that Brandon had the right to be missing. But after further insistence from his parents, law enforcement finally agreed to conduct a search. Later that day, investigators tracked Brandon's phone records and made a shocking discovery. He had not been anywhere near Lind. Instead, his calls were traced to a location almost 30 miles away near Taunton. A search of the area soon led authorities to his car, which had indeed been stuck in a ditch. However, there was no sign of Brandon himself. Search dogs picked up his scent, tracking his path along a gravel road and through a field. The scent trail led to the Yellow Medicine River, where it momentarily stopped before continuing on the other side. This discovery led authorities to believe that he had managed to cross the river, continuing north toward the Yellow Medicine County line before the trail abruptly ended. With no signs of Brandon anywhere, theories began to emerge. The first and most obvious was that he had fallen into the river and drowned. However, extensive searches of the river yielded no evidence of his body. Moreover, if he had fallen into the water, his phone should have been found nearby, yet it never was. A second theory emerged: hypothermia. Given the cold temperatures that night, it was possible Brandon had become disoriented and succumbed to the elements. But again, search teams scoured the area extensively, covering over 120 square miles, and found nothing. Then, an even more disturbing theory surfaced. Some speculated that Brandon may have been hit by a passing vehicle, and the driver, panicked, chose to hide the body. But no evidence supported this scenario either. Another possibility, albeit chilling, suggested that Brandon had encountered someone with sinister intentions. The idea of a rogue farmer or even a serial killer lurking in the shadows was horrifying, but not entirely implausible. Some reports indicated that a local farmer refused to allow authorities to search his property, despite search dogs picking up Brandon's scent on his farming equipment. The refusal only fueled suspicions, but no hard evidence was ever found. To this day, Brandon Swanson has never been seen or heard from again. His case remains one of the most baffling disappearances in modern history. His parents continue to seek answers, but the truth remains elusive. So what do you think happened to Brandon Swanson? Let us know your theories and thoughts. Sophia Tariq moved to the United States from Bangladesh in the mid-1990s, accompanied by her 3-year-old son, Mohammed Tassim Taif, and her husband, Mohammed Tariq. By 1999, Tariq had returned to Bangladesh, leaving Sophia and Taif behind in Rochester, Minnesota, where they live with her sister, Mary Zaman, her brother-in-law, Iqbal Ahmed, and their son, Asif Iqbal. The family had originally come to the U.S. on 11-week visitor visas in 1996 and later settled in Minnesota, where Zaman and Ahmed worked as servers at India Garden Restaurant. Though their employer never saw any direct confrontations between them, Ahmed reportedly suspected Zaman of infidelity, and she had shown up to work with facial scratches in 1999, refusing to explain how she got them. In August of that year, credit card receipts revealed Ahmed was preparing to leave Minnesota with his son, and on September 5th, he purchased a hand axe and extra heavy-duty contractor's garbage bags. On September 17th, Zaman, Taif, and Sophia vanished from Rochester. Soon after, Ahmed called the restaurant owner, claiming his wife had left for New York City with another man. By the end of the month, their apartment was abandoned, their personal belongings and Ahmed's vehicle left behind, and Iqbal had stopped attending school. Authorities soon uncovered troubling details from the past. Ahmed had previously been charged with attempting to murder Zaman in New York in 1998 after locking her in a bathroom and strangling her until she lost consciousness. But the case was dropped when she refused to testify against him. Then, in November 1999, 2 months after their disappearance, Zaman and Taif's decapitated bodies were found in a ditch near Rochester, stuffed inside garbage bags, with their heads never recovered. The victims remained unidentified until mid-2000, and law enforcement kept their names confidential while building their case against Ahmed. Investigators determined that Ahmed and Iqbal had traveled to New York City shortly after the murders and later fled to Bangladesh. In July 2000, Ahmed was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder, but due to the lack of an extradition treaty between the U.S. and Bangladesh, authorities struggled to bring him back for prosecution. His fingerprints, taken during a 1998 taxi driver job application in New York, matched a print found on the bag containing Taif's remains. FBI agents located Ahmed in Bangladesh in December 2000, where he falsely claimed he had spoken to Zaman earlier that year and believed she was still alive. Meanwhile, Iqbal was found living unharmed in a nearby village. Authorities publicly revealed the victims' identities and the murder charges against Ahmed in October 2001, but he remained in Bangladesh. By 2005, Ahmed had been sentenced to life in prison for 2 unrelated murders in Bangladesh, and investigators assumed he would never return to the U.S. to face justice for the killings of his wife and nephew. In September 2010, authorities learned that Ahmed had died. Sophia Tariq was never found, and investigators suspect she was murdered as well. However, her case remains unsolved and is no longer actively investigated. Georgia and Clock Smith departed from her son's home in Champlin, Minnesota, at approximately 6:30 p.m. on June 30th, 1999, intending to drive 125 miles northeast to her summer residence in Minong, Wisconsin. She was behind the wheel of her dark metallic blue 2-door 1984 Mercedes-Benz 190D sedan with Wisconsin license plate number TXB 401, but she never arrived at her destination, and her vehicle was never recovered. Georgia was known for her independent nature, living alone at her summer home, though her loved ones had growing concerns about her mental state and her ability to drive safely. At the time of her disappearance, she did not possess a valid driver's license, yet she insisted on continuing to drive. Another complication was her habit of turning off the telephone ringer in her Minong home, which often made it difficult for family members to reach her. Because of this, Georgia was not immediately reported missing. Her family only realized she had vanished when they arrived in Wisconsin for the 4th of July holiday weekend, a full 3 days after she had left Champlin. In the midst of their growing fears, an employee at a Radio Shack in Spooner, Wisconsin, came forward and claimed that a woman matching Georgia's description had visited the store on July 2nd, 3 days after she had last been seen. However, authorities were never able to verify the sighting. As the search for Georgia continued, the case took an unexpected turn later in the summer of 1999 when a mysterious woman dropped off a handwritten note at a Walmart in Coon Rapids, Minnesota. The note, addressed to one of Georgia's grandchildren, claimed that she was being cared for by an unnamed individual who was unaware that she had been reported missing. Investigators attempted to track down the woman who left the note, but were unsuccessful, and the lead ultimately went nowhere. Georgia was known to avoid major interstates, instead preferring smaller highways and rural roads to reach her destinations. It was believed she may have traveled through Cambridge, Minnesota, and the towns of Siren and Spooner, Wisconsin, but her exact route was never confirmed. Complicating matters further was the fact that a road detour had blocked part of her usual route in late June 1999, which could have caused her to take an unfamiliar path. Her son, who saw her shortly before she left, recalled that her behavior seemed normal at the time. Yet some of her children suspected that she may have become disoriented while driving and suffered a fatal accident along one of the many forested or swampy roads she frequently used. The remote and heavily wooded terrain surrounding much of her travel route left open the grim possibility that her car and remains could have gone undiscovered if she had veered off the road. However, with no clear evidence of an accident and no sign of Georgia or her vehicle, other family members feared that foul play had been involved in her disappearance, though there has been no concrete evidence to support any particular theory. Georgia was a private and somewhat shy person, but was deeply devoted to her family. Her sudden disappearance was entirely out of character. She left behind 7 children, 24 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren, all of whom still hope for closure. Though authorities conducted extensive searches and followed multiple leads, Georgia and Clock Smith's case remains unsolved, and her whereabouts are still unknown. Vicky Sungard was last seen in the early morning hours of April 19, 1987, Easter Sunday, at a party on Cedar Street in Alexandria, Minnesota. She was 32 years old at the time and was never heard from again. The following morning, her vehicle was discovered parked just a few blocks away, with her purse and asthma inhaler still inside. Given that her asthma had been acting up in the days leading to her disappearance, her loved ones found it deeply troubling that she would have left behind something so essential to her health. What made her vanishing even more suspicious was that she also left behind her 2 young sons, an action that was completely out of character for her. A week before she went missing, Vicky confided in her sister that she planned to leave her husband and move out of the area. She had described him as violent and admitted she did not trust him around their children. However, despite concerns about her safety, her husband was investigated by authorities but was ultimately not considered a suspect in her disappearance. One of the last individuals known to have seen Vicky was Michael Dale Benson, a man with a deeply disturbing history of sexual violence. Just 2 years after Vicky vanished in 1989, Benson was convicted of raping a woman in Alexandria. He was subsequently incarcerated and later civilly committed to a hospital for life due to his dangerous nature. In 2006, he managed to escape from the hospital, prompting a manhunt, but was captured several weeks later. While in custody, Benson admitted to having raped 5 additional women in Colorado and California, further solidifying his history as a predator. Because of his past and proximity to Vicky at the time of her disappearance, he became a suspect in her case. However, despite suspicions, he has continued to deny involvement and has never been charged in connection with what happened to her. Vicky's disappearance remains an open mystery, with no confirmed answers and no known whereabouts. Her family has never believed that she would have willingly abandoned her children, and with the years passing without resolution, they continue to seek answers and justice. Authorities suspect foul play, and though Benson remains a person of interest, the case remains unsolved. Nathaniel Williams was last seen on September 28, 2004, in the 400 block of East 10th Street in Morris, Minnesota, on the campus of the University of Minnesota at Morris, where he was a student. He had been planning a solo fishing and hunting trip to Two Harbors, Minnesota, with the possibility of heading into the Pomme de Terre River Valley area. Nathaniel, an experienced outdoorsman, was known for taking extended trips into the wilderness, often hunting with both a gun and a bow and arrows. His love for nature and solitude had played a significant role in his decision to attend the University of Minnesota at Morris, his only college application, because of the vast outdoor opportunities the region offered. However, this trip would prove to be different, as Nathaniel never returned home and was never heard from again. 2 days after he was last seen, some sheriff's deputies in Lake County, Minnesota, spotted his distinctive teal and white 1966 Ford F-150 pickup truck along Kawashiwi Lake Road, off County Road 7, north of Two Harbors. The sighting raised immediate concerns, as there was no sign of Nathaniel himself, nor any indication of where he had gone. The truck was later found abandoned on a back road near Kawashiwi Lake in the Boundary Waters canoe area. The vehicle was low on gas, but otherwise intact, with no signs of foul play or struggle in or around the scene. A search of the surrounding area, conducted by authorities and volunteers, failed to yield any sign of Nathaniel, his clothing, or his fishing and hunting gear. It was as if he had simply vanished into the wilderness. At the time of his disappearance, Nathaniel's family was residing in Silver Spring, Maryland, but he had lived in Morris with roommates during the school year. He had a unique and adventurous upbringing, having spent parts of his childhood in various locations around the world, including South America. His passion for the outdoors was evident in his daily life. He often prioritized hunting and fishing over attending class, preferring the tranquility of the wild over the structure of academia. His love for nature made it unsurprising that he would venture into the remote woods of northern Minnesota alone, but what remained troubling was the complete lack of evidence regarding his fate. Authorities quickly ruled out suicide as a possibility, citing his close relationship with his family and his overall enthusiasm for life. His disappearance, however, remained deeply perplexing. Given his experience as an outdoorsman, some theorized that he may have gotten lost or succumbed to harsh elements, but seasoned hunters and fishermen typically prepare for worst-case scenarios. If he had been injured, it seemed odd that no trace of his gear or clothing was ever found, despite extensive searches. One chilling possibility was that Nathaniel encountered someone in the remote wilderness who meant him harm. Though it was rare for crimes to take place in the Boundary Waters canoe area, it was not impossible. With the region's vast and heavily wooded terrain, a person could easily disappear without a trace. Another theory suggested that he may have met with an accident, falling into a body of water or suffering a fatal injury while hiking or hunting. However, if this were the case, it was strange that his belongings had not been recovered, particularly since experienced hunters typically carry survival gear. Despite the lack of definitive answers, both Morris and Lake County authorities have continued to investigate his case. Years later, Nathaniel's disappearance remains an enduring mystery. His family, desperate for closure, still holds on a hope that one day they will find out what happened to their son. Whether he was lost to the wilderness, met with foul play, or suffered an accident that left no trace. Leanna Warner was a lively and fearless 5-year-old girl when she vanished without a trace from her neighborhood in Chisholm, Minnesota, on June 14, 2003. Known for her outgoing nature and love of dolls and bicycle riding, she had spent the afternoon attempting to visit a friend's house a block and a half from her own home. She left her residence around 4:30 p.m., but when she arrived at her friend's home, no one was there. What happened to Leanna after that remains a chilling mystery. The last confirmed sighting of her was between 5 o'clock and 5:15 p.m. as she walked westbound on either Southwest 2nd or 3rd Street. She never made it home. By 5:30 p.m., Leanna's mother, Tiffany Kaylin Warner, became concerned and began searching for her daughter, enlisting neighborhood children to help. Despite checking every familiar location and calling out for Leanna, there was no sign of her. As the hours passed with no success, Kaylin made the fateful call to the police between 8:40 and 9 p.m. reporting her daughter missing. What followed was an extensive search operation that lasted several days. Authorities deployed helicopters, bloodhounds, and search teams across the area, yet Leanna was nowhere to be found. Given her age and the search efforts involved, law enforcement quickly leaned toward the theory of abduction, believing they would have found her if she had simply wandered off. Bloodhounds were able to track her scent to the edge of the road, but lost it at that point, suggesting she may have been taken into a vehicle. During the investigation, several suspicious individuals and vehicles were reported in the area at the time of Leanna's disappearance. A man in his mid-30s, described as approximately 5 feet 10 inches and 155 pounds with a dark-colored tattoo of a star or sun on his right arm, was seen walking in the neighborhood around the time she went missing. However, this individual was never identified. Additionally, 2 vehicles, a maroon and blue 2-door Cadillac driven by an African-American man in his 20s or 30s with a bald or shaven head, and an older model rusty brown pickup truck driven by a Caucasian man with black curly hair, were seen in the vicinity. Despite thorough investigative efforts, neither the vehicles nor their drivers were ever located, leaving authorities without any concrete suspects or leads. A disturbing development in the case came in August 2003 when authorities arrested 24-year-old Matthew James Curtis in Chisholm on child pornography charges. Though unrelated to Leanna's case, Curtis' proximity to the area and the nature of his crime led investigators to question him multiple times regarding her disappearance. Given the circumstances, his truck was seized and processed for DNA evidence. However, there was no indication that Leanna had ever been inside the vehicle, and no forensic evidence tied him to her case. A month later, in September 2003, just one day before he was scheduled to appear in court, Curtis was found dead in a gravel pit 8 or 9 miles outside of Chisholm. Police ruled his death a suicide, stating that he suffocated himself with a plastic bag. With no tangible link between Curtis and Leanna, he was ultimately ruled out as a suspect. Despite the exhaustive search and multiple leads, Leanna's whereabouts remain unknown, and authorities strongly suspect foul play in her disappearance. However, her parents were never considered suspects. While both Kaylin and her husband, Christopher Warner, had been previously divorced, and Christopher had a contentious past with his ex-wife, including mutual restraining orders and allegations of threats, the difficulties in his prior marriage were determined to be unrelated to Leanna's case. The Warners had only recently moved to Chisholm, hoping for a fresh start when their daughter vanished. Leanna's case stands out due to her adventurous nature and strong survival instincts, which, according to those who knew her, were advanced for a child of her age. She was known to be independent and occasionally wandered, but nothing about her disappearance suggested she had simply gotten lost. The abrupt loss of her scent at the roadside pointed toward an abduction, yet no witnesses came forward to confirm seeing her enter a vehicle. The case, marked by frustration and dead ends, only grew colder with time. Years later, tragedy struck the Warner family again. In 2022, Leanna's mother, Kaylin, passed away from cancer, never knowing what happened to her daughter. However, Christopher and Leanna's 2 half-sisters remain active in the search for answers. Even after 2 decades, the mystery of what happened to Leanna Warner lingers, haunting the small community of Chisholm. Whether she was taken by an opportunistic predator, someone familiar with the area, or the unidentified individual seen in the neighborhood that day, remains unknown. But when I first heard about the murder of Mary Catherine and Suzanne Marie Raker, I was shocked that I had never come across it before. A case this horrifying, 2 sisters, just 15 and 12, brutally murdered, should have been widely known, yet it never seemed to gain national attention like some other cases. The Raker sisters grew up in St. Cloud, Minnesota, a city about an hour northwest of the Twin Cities. It was the 1970s, a time when kids still walked to the store by themselves, when the idea of small-town safety wasn't questioned. The sisters, Mary and Suzanne, were part of a big Catholic family with 6 children, 4 girls and 2 boys. Their parents, Fred and Rita, worked hard to provide for them, and by all accounts, the girls were bright, kind, and full of promise. Mary, at 15, was already thinking about college. She was ambitious, teaching herself to play the guitar and piano, and had dreams of what her future might hold. Suzanne, just 12, was quieter but just as dedicated to her goals. She was a student who played the violin for hours a day and already aspired to be a doctor. She even cut out pictures of houses from magazines, making plans to build her parents a big house with a swimming pool one day. They were just kids, full of hope, with their entire lives ahead of them. On September 2nd, 1974, Mary asked her mom if she could go shopping for school supplies. Rita found it odd, considering Mary had just been shopping with a friend 2 days before, but Mary was insistent. Susan didn't need anything, but she wanted to tag along with her older sister. Their 13-year-old sister, Betsy, was originally going to go too, but decided to stay home instead. The 2 girls left their house around 11:30 a.m. Their father, Fred, was outside painting the house when he saw them off. He waved, and they waved back. It was the last time he would see them alive. The sisters walked toward Zayre's shopping center, about a mile from their home. On the way, they stopped at Shopko, where the manager recognized them. They didn't stay long before heading to Zayre's, a store that sold everything from groceries to clothing. There, they ran into their 75-year-old neighbor, Jacob Younger. As he watched them walk away, he heard Suzanne say something to Mary that sent a chill down his spine. "I don't want to go with that man. I don't like him. Let's not." Jacob later recalled seeing a nervous-looking man sitting in a blue Chevrolet Impala in the parking lot, just watching people. He sat in his own car for a while, keeping an eye on the man, but when nothing happened, he eventually drove home. Mary and Susan were supposed to be back by 3 p.m. Mary had a carpool, leaving at 4 o'clock to take her back to her all-girls boarding school in Little Falls. But the girls never returned. Fred and Rita knew something was wrong immediately. They were good girls, responsible, trustworthy. They might sneak a cigarette or say a bad word to get a reaction, but they were not troublemakers. Fred and Rita began calling around, asking if anyone had seen them, but no one had. By 7 p.m., Fred drove to the police station to report them missing. The police, unfortunately, didn't take it seriously. They assumed the girls had run away. They even suggested that Fred and Rita go down to the bus station with their daughter's pictures to see if they had bought a ticket somewhere. It was insulting. Fred and Rita knew their girls hadn't run away. They were left to search on their own, with friends and neighbors helping. They walked through the woods near Zayre's, put up missing posters, and contacted local radio stations to spread the word. Rita spent hours on the phone, calling everyone she could think of. Still, the police refused to take action. It wasn't until 3 weeks later that they finally acknowledged the possibility that the girls had not left voluntarily. Helicopters were sent up. The National Guard was called in, but by then it was too late. On September 28, 1974, 2 teenage boys were walking near the abandoned Meridian Quarry, a popular swimming spot west of St. Cloud. They noticed something in the tall grass near the water's edge. It was Suzanne's body. Horrified, they ran to a nearby house and called the police. A few hours later, divers found Mary's body 40 feet below the water, resting on a ledge. Suzanne was still fully clothed, but Mary was naked from the waist down. Her pants and underwear had been tossed into the quarry after her, getting caught on the rocky edges. Her green army jacket, the one with Raker embroidered on the pocket, had also been thrown in. Mary's sweater and bra had been cut down the front. The girls had been stabbed multiple times, Suzanne 12 times, Mary 6. The wounds were in their chest and abdomen, meaning they had faced their killer. Neither girl had defensive wounds, suggesting they hadn't fought back. Or maybe Suzanne had, but the decomposition of her body made it difficult to tell. The weapon was identified as a small, double-edged knife. The discovery devastated the town of St. Cloud. The murders were brutal and senseless. Police urged anyone with information to come forward. A man at Briggs Tavern claimed to have seen the girls there around 2 p.m. on the day they disappeared, accompanied by 2 men, one around 28, the other 16. He recognized Mary's jacket and remembered how Susan looked uncomfortable. Other witnesses said they saw the girls walking toward the quarry around 3 p.m., accompanied by a tall man. The coroner estimated their time of death to be between 3 o'clock and 4 p.m., and Mary's watch had stopped at 3:25. The timeline fit, but the leads went nowhere. The case went cold. The only physical evidence found, a pair of men's glasses, sat in a detective's desk drawer for 10 years before being discovered in 1984. They were gold-rimmed, made in West Germany, and fit someone with a broad face. But the lead went nowhere. Suspects came and went. A man named Michael, a former neighbor, had a violent past, kidnapping a woman and later murdering an 8-year-old, but his glasses prescription didn't match. Notorious serial killer Ted Bundy was even considered, but a gas station receipt placed him in Colorado at the time. Another potential suspect, Lloyd Welch, later convicted of murdering the Lyon sisters in 1975, had attacked a teenager in St. Cloud just days before Mary and Suzanne's deaths. But police ruled him out. The name that kept coming up was Herb Notch, a classmate of Mary's and a known predator. He worked at Zayre's, lived near the Raker family's grandparents, and had a disturbing history of violence. 2 years after Mary and Suzanne's murders, he kidnapped and brutally assaulted a 14-year-old girl, stabbing her multiple times. Miraculously, she survived. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison, but served only 10. Over the years, he continued to commit violent crimes, yet police never had enough evidence to charge him with the Raker murders. In 2017, when Herb was dying in a St. Cloud hospital, Mary and Suzanne's mother, Rita, confronted him. Wearing a microphone, she asked him if he had killed her daughters. He pointed his finger at her and said, "I give you my word I didn't do it." Rita left feeling certain he was lying. He died days later, taking any secrets he had with him. The case remains unsolved, but the Raker family never gave up. Rita and Fred dedicated their lives to helping other grieving families, forming support groups, and working with Crime Stoppers. Fred passed away in 2012, and Rita, now in her late 80s, still hopes for justice. Nearly 50 years later, their daughter's killer remains unknown, a shadow over the town of St. Cloud. Anyone with information is urged to call the Stearns County Sheriff's Office. A $50,000 reward remains for information leading to an arrest. Until then, Mary and Suzanne's case remains one of Minnesota's most haunting unsolved murders.